Okay, welcome to the latest video in my series on defending the authority of the Bible. This is the third video in the section of that series concerning Old Testament prophecy. In the last video, I went through the passage from Isaiah known as the suffering servant. Here, I will be taking a look at a surprisingly accurate prophecy about the Messiah that was fulfilled in the life of Jesus Christ. To understand the purpose of this, imagine you read a wanted poster for a robbery suspect, and it gives a description of certain characteristics to look for. Perhaps he is a 5', 11-inch, well-built male wearing a black hoodie and blue jeans. If you saw someone walking down the street that looked like that, you would suspect that they are the robber. Why? Because they match the description. Likewise, the Old Testament gives detailed descriptions of what the Messiah would look like, predicting what he would do, how he would die, and what his ministry would look like. The fact that Christ fulfilled them suggests that he is the Messiah. And the difference, of course, between the wanted poster and the Old Testament, besides the nature of the event, is that the Old Testament was written hundreds of years before, not after, the events in them happened. If we saw a wanted poster that predicted the event in advance, that would be eye-opening, right? In fact, let's say the poster was written about 550 years before the event happened, and it predicted with at least 99% accuracy the time of the event. That would be pretty crazy, right? Likewise, Daniel 9:25-26 predicts within 1 year Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, otherwise known as Palm Sunday, about 550 years in advance. And this is a highly technical prophecy. It takes a lot of unraveling to actually see this, which is why I have an entire video dedicated to it. Starting with the passage, Daniel 9:25-26 reads, "Know therefore and discern, that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Anointed One, the Prince, shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. It shall be built again with street and moat, even in troublous times. And after the 62 weeks shall the Anointed One be cut off, and shall have nothing." Note that I am using the ASV as opposed to the ESV that I usually use, because in my opinion the ASV is more clear with this passage. But let me break down how we will unpack these verses. In part 1, I will introduce the passage, giving its date of authorship, what it predicts, and I will be introducing a timeline to help us analyze that prediction. We will be filling out this timeline as we go. In part 2, I will fill out this timeline showing how the weeks in Daniel 9 are actually periods of 7 years, how the Jews used a 360-day year instead of a 365-day year like we do, and I will date the decree given to rebuild Jerusalem that the passage mentions. All of these are necessary to see how precisely Jesus fulfilled this passage. In part 3, I will calculate the exact date of Palm Sunday, or Jesus' triumphal entry, and I will show that the number of days from the decree to the triumphal entry is almost exactly what Daniel 9 says it will be. In part 4, I will summarize and give the implications of this argument. Now, I am not an expert in Old Testament prophecy, so I am largely consulting the expertise of those who are. The primary source is a book called The Coming Prince by Sir Robert Anderson, although I also draw from the teachings of the late Pastor John MacArthur, Bible teacher Steve Gregg, Got Questions Ministries, and others. Much ink has been spilled on Daniel 9, and I am sure that I will not address all potential counter-arguments. However, I do not think that I need to address all of them, for Daniel 9 only needs to be roughly accurate to show inspiration. With that being said, I will point out potential counter-arguments when I am aware of them. So in part 1, I will introduce the passage. Let me give a bit of context for the book of Daniel. Daniel is one of 4 major Old Testament prophets, along with Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. But there are about 12 minor prophets. But Daniel was from the southern kingdom of Israel and was exiled from his homeland to Babylon when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon took over Judah starting in 605 BC. This period of exile lasted for 70 years, and Daniel received the prophecy in chapter 9 near the very end of these 70 years, probably around 537 or 538 BC. But the book of Daniel is divided into two major sections. The first 6 out of its 12 chapters focus largely on narrative and contain stories like Daniel in the lion's den, or the story of Daniel's 3 friends being thrown into the fiery furnace by King Nebuchadnezzar. And the second half, which Daniel 9 is a part of, largely focuses on prophecy and contains some of the most startlingly accurate prophecies in the entire Bible. In fact, the prophecies in chapter 11 about the 4 kingdoms of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome are so accurate that some scholars have dated the book of Daniel to the 2nd century BC so as to place the prophecy after the fact. On that topic, let me present a brief defense of the traditional dating of the book of Daniel, which is around the 6th century BC, when Daniel claimed to have written it. There are several indirect arguments given from videos prior in this video series that would corroborate the date. Firstly, I argued from the New Testament's reliability as a historical document. It is highly reliable, more reliable than any other document of ancient history that we have, by the standards used by modern scholars on secular documents. And this means that if the New Testament affirms the traditional dates of the Old Testament prophets, which it does, then we should probably believe it, given its credibility as a historical document. Secondly, the chief character of the New Testament, Jesus Christ, is God, which I defend in my video on Jesus' deity. And Jesus largely affirms the truth of the Old Testament as we have it, which would include the traditional dates of authorship. In fact, in his prediction of the end times in Matthew 24, he quoted the abomination of desolation from the book of Daniel. Thirdly, the video titled Arguments for Scripture as a Whole give reasons as to why the authors of Scripture, generally speaking, were not mistaken or had dishonest motives. This means that we should believe that the books they claimed to write were actually written by them when they claimed to live. But let me give more specific arguments, which I get from Josh and Sean McDowell's book titled Evidence That Demands a Verdict. The book of Daniel has been suspected of being written much later than the 6th century BC by modern scholars, with the primary date being proposed in the 2nd century BC, and they would say as one of their chief reasons that the book of Daniel was written in different languages, demonstrating a different author for the prophetic portion. That is, the narrative portion is primarily written in Aramaic, and the prophetic portion is primarily written in Hebrew. But this difference is explainable by other hypotheses. Firstly, it is likely that Daniel was bilingual, given that he was a Hebrew raised in Babylonian courts and was likely exposed to different languages. Secondly, Aramaic is a more literal language than Hebrew and is better suited for conveying narrative, whereas Hebrew is more figurative and conveys profound theological thoughts and is better suited for conveying prophecy. Thirdly, the prophecies were given primarily to the Jewish people, so it would make sense that Daniel would write them in their own language. This is not the case for the narrative. So, different languages do not necessitate different authors, leaving us with the default position, which is that Daniel's author and date of authorship is as written. Some would say that the presence of Greek loanwords in the book of Daniel suggests Greek influence on its writing, but the Greeks weren't prominent until after the 6th century BC, and yet we have these words that seem to be borrowed or at least influenced by their language. Well, it turns out that many of the loanwords are actually Persian in origin, and there is evidence that the Greeks did have influence in their surrounding cultures as early as the 6th century BC. The book of Daniel has also been attacked because of the lack of historical corroboration for some of its major events. This especially includes King Nebuchadnezzar's 7 years of insanity, which is not recorded in any of the Babylonian records. But a lack of corroborating evidence does not mean contradicting evidence. Just because the Bible has not been affirmed by external sources does not mean that we should disbelieve it. In fact, in the study of ancient history, quite the opposite is practiced. The truth of a historical document is generally taken to be true unless there is a good reason to disbelieve it, not the other way around. And whatever the ultimate document that the scholars are using to hold the Bible accountable to, they must accept as reliable despite not being corroborated, or they would not be using it. Ultimately, if one is going to criticize the Bible from a historical perspective, they must have some other historical document that they think is true from which to criticize it. And yet, these cannot be corroborated or they would not be ultimate. Why does the skeptic choose as their ultimate document these other sources instead of the Bible? Although it could be justified with historical evidence, oftentimes it has more to do with philosophical, moral, or theological reasons. For example, some might say, well, the account of a king of Babylon going mad for 7 years is ludicrous and fantastical, and should therefore be treated with skepticism. And this is a philosophical argument, not a historical one. I address arguments like these in one of the first videos in this series titled Methodology. So, the traditional date of authorship of Daniel stands. It is not threatened by the different languages, by Greek loanwords, or by a lack of historical cross-references for some of its events. But as it is, the book of Daniel stands, making its fulfilled prophecy all the more astounding. Also note that to prove my point in this particular video, I only need the book of Daniel to have been written roughly about 100 years before Christ, which shifting the date of authorship to the 2nd century BC does not do. No, so now that we know what Daniel is and when it was written, we can appreciate the meticulously accurate way in which its prophecies were fulfilled by Jesus Christ. So let's introduce the passage. This is speaking of the Messiah, an Old Testament character that is frequently prophesied about, whose role was to save Israel from their oppression and establish God's kingdom on earth forever and ever. And the Jews looked forward to this. We know it is speaking of the Messiah because of the Hebrew term it uses for the anointed one, which is Mashiach Nagid. This is a kingly term and is often translated as Messiah. In fact, many other Bible translations besides the ASV will translate it as Messiah the Prince. And we know from other Old Testament prophecies, such as Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53, that Jesus, beyond a reasonable doubt, is the Messiah. This is why I put Daniel 9 toward the end of my series on Old Testament prophecy, so I could make that point at the beginning of this video. I do not think that I need to make it, as Daniel 9 could probably stand on its own. Nevertheless, I will err on the safe side. So, based on prior videos, it is reasonable to say that this prophecy is speaking of Jesus. So, what event in the life of Christ could this be talking about? Now, some say that it refers to the beginning of his ministry, or even earlier, his birth. But that would leave at least a 3-year gap between the end of the 69th week and the Messiah being cut off, which we know to be Jesus' crucifixion, whereas the text implies that it comes shortly afterwards. Besides, according to the John MacArthur sermon on the topic, the passage is referring to the presentation of this prince unto his nation Israel. So he is not only the prince, but this is a time where Israel sees him as their prince. And there have been 2 major proposed fulfillments of this. The first is baptism, where Jesus was set apart by God the Father and the Holy Spirit to be the Messiah. But the problem with this is that he was not seen that way before other men, at least not before many. It was mostly a private affair. But the most obvious fulfillment of this was in his triumphal entry, when the people from across the entire nation of Israel, who were gathered for Passover, were singing his praises, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, Son of David is a messianic term from the Old Testament. So we have much of Israel recognizing Jesus as their Messiah, their prince. Of course, it was for the wrong reasons, but regardless of their motives, this was the only time in Jesus' ministry that this recognition happened. This event is commonly celebrated in the Catholic Church as Palm Sunday because the people cut the branches from palm trees and laid them at Jesus' feet. I mentioned that I would put out potential counter-arguments when relevant. I do think that determining the end date of the prophecy to be the triumphal entry could be argued with. But assuming the triumphal entry, we can generate a rough timeline by which to analyze Daniel 9. It says that from the issuing of the command to rebuild Jerusalem until the time that it is finished will be 7 weeks. And I put weeks in quotations because it is not really weeks like we think of weeks, as we will see. And then it says that 62 weeks from that, meaning 62 weeks, will be the coming of the Messiah. So we have a 7-week period followed by a 62-week period, bringing the total amount of time from the time of the command to rebuild Jerusalem to the triumphal entry to 69 weeks. We will fill in this timeline step by step. So in part 2, we will fill out the timeline. The first detail is to unpack is that the weeks in Daniel 9 refer to periods of 7 years. So each day is 1 year, not a week like we mean it. This has significant support. The first reason for this is that in the context of the prophecy, Daniel is praying about years and he is answered in weeks. The context is that Daniel reads the prophet Jeremiah, who says that the time of Judah's exile will only last 70 years. Daniel realizes that he is at the tail end of that 70 years and gets excited about it and basically asks God to hurry up, confessing his own sin and the sin of his people. And the prophecy is given as a response to this prayer. So it seems that if God did not intend the weeks to be years, that it would not match the context. Secondly, we see in Leviticus 25:8 the instructions laid out for celebrating the year of Jubilee, which says, "You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years." So they were to celebrate the year of Jubilee every 49 years, signified by 7 weeks. So the use of weeks to represent years is in fact a biblical practice. The third reason appeals to common sense and asks, how could it have taken only 7 weeks from the time of the prophecy to rebuild Jerusalem? If I assume that the events in Nehemiah are the fulfillment of the first part of this prophecy, which I defend later, Nehemiah first had to mobilize the people who were willing to help him rebuild the wall, and it is implied that they had to travel hundreds of miles across the desert. Even when they got there, it took them 52 days to rebuild the wall because of opposition. Of course, 52 days by itself, not including travel and prep time, is greater than 49 days. Fourthly, I appeal to scholarly consensus. The vast majority of Old Testament scholars agree that Daniel is talking about years here. Not that that is a reason in and of itself to believe something, but I do think it is significant when it is combined with the other 3 reasons. So if we do our math, we can substitute the 7 weeks with 7 times 7 years, or 49 years. So it would be 49 years from the time of the command to the time when Jerusalem is finished, and it would be 62 times 7, or 434 years, from that time until the Messiah would come. 434 plus 49 is 483, so Daniel is saying 483 years from the time the command is given, the Messiah would come. That last number, the 483 years, is the subject of further study. The next relevant point is that 1 year is 360 days, not 365 days like we are used to. This is because the Jewish calendar was being used. This prophecy was written by a Jew to a Jewish people. But if we look at Genesis 7:11, it says that Noah's flood lasted for 5 months. And in Genesis 7:24 and 8:3, it says that Noah's flood lasted for 150 days. If we do the math, 150 days divided by 5 months equals 30 days per month. Similarly, if we combine Revelation 13:5, which says that the tribulation will last for 42 months, and Revelation 12:6, which says that it will last for 1,260 days, we can do the math there and say that 1,260 divided by 42 is 30 days per month. So, according to the Jewish calendar, there were 30 days per month times 12 months a year, yielding 360 days per year. This means that the 483 years mentioned in Daniel actually comes out to about 470 years using the Julian calendar. But to keep things simple, so we're not switching between Julian and Jewish calendars, not to mention the Gregorian calendar, we will measure our time in terms of days. 483 years times 360 days per year is 173,880 days. So Daniel is saying that 173,880 days from the time the command is issued to rebuild Jerusalem, the Messiah will come, which we know to be the triumphal entry of Jesus. A potential counter-argument to the 360 days as years is, well, what did the Jews do with the leap years? Because if their year is 5 days shorter than the solar year, over time their months would not be during the same seasons as they were before, leading to a rather unreliable way of telling time. It is possible that the Jews didn't think this was a problem like we do, or that they had a system like we do for adjusting for leap years. Either way, I think the biblical evidence is strong for Anderson's position, so this does not affect the conclusion. So here is our updated outline where we replaced the 483 years with 173,880 days. The next step is answering the question, when was the decree given to rebuild Jerusalem? In other words, when does the clock start ticking for the Messiah's arrival? And there are 4 options for this. There was a decree given by King Cyrus of Persia in 537 BC. That is, shortly after 539 BC, where Cyrus conquered Babylon, which housed the Jewish remnant. He gave them permission to return to their homeland. There was another decree given by King Darius in 518 BC. Now some have argued, quite convincingly to me, that King Cyrus and King Darius are the same figure. So the decree of Darius is likely a second decree by Cyrus, but it doesn't affect my point. And then there were 2 decrees given by King Artaxerxes, given in about 458 BC and in 445 BC. Although it is debated, according to the John MacArthur sermon on the topic, the second decree of Artaxerxes is likely the decree that Daniel has in mind, because it is the only decree to involve the actual rebuilding of Jerusalem. And that made a lot of sense to me. Besides, from a Christian perspective, the runner-up, which is Cyrus's decree, was given in 537 BC, would have placed the Messiah's coming well before the time of Christ. But the second decree of Artaxerxes is summarized in Nehemiah chapter 2. Now Nehemiah 2:1 says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, and then proceeds to give the details of the decree. Now we know even from secular sources that the reign of Artaxerxes began in about 465 BC, meaning that the 20th year of his reign was in 445 BC. So, sometime in the month of Nisan in 445 BC, King Artaxerxes gave the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. Now it is uncertain if Nehemiah is counting the years of Artaxerxes' reign from the time that his predecessor died or from the time that he actually assumed the throne. Here is what I mean. King Xerxes, his predecessor, was murdered by the usurper Artabanus in July of 465 BC. Artabanus then reigned from July of 465 BC to February of 464 BC, a period of about 7 months. Artaxerxes actually killed Artabanus in hand-to-hand combat and began reigning in February of 464 BC. So, where do we start counting the 20th year of his reign? Is it in 465 BC when Xerxes was murdered, or from 464 BC when Artaxerxes actually assumed the throne? Nehemiah gives us a hint. He says in chapter 1, verse 1, that the month of Chislev, which correlates roughly to our month of November, fell in the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign. And in Nehemiah 2:1, he mentions that the following Nisan, which roughly correlates to our month of April, was also in the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign. For November and April to be counted in the same year, that means that Nehemiah cannot have been counting from a time between November and April. But this would rule out the second option of February of 464 BC, because that's between November and April. But in that case, the month of Chislev and Nisan would be in separate years. Now I think that there is room for debate here. Other scholars count the fulfillment of Daniel 9 starting from 464 BC, and this makes sense. Why would one start counting the years of a king's reign before they actually ascended to the throne? I think it is possible that Nehemiah, since he is not Persian, is trying to simplify things by deleting the 7-month reign of Artabanus. That is, the Jewish people to which this prophecy was written would not have been overly concerned about the inner workings of Persian politics. Or maybe because Nehemiah was likely the cupbearer to Xerxes, perhaps he was loyal to Xerxes and his successor, not the usurper Artabanus who murdered him. So in Nehemiah's mind, he did not recognize Artabanus as actually having reigned. Or maybe Nehemiah simply didn't recognize usurpers as kings, regardless of who he was loyal to. Another weakness, as we will see, is that using a 465 BC decree date places the year of Jesus' crucifixion in AD 32, which goes against the majority of scholars that place it in AD 33. So I think there is room for debate here but because of what Nehemiah says, as referenced in The Coming Prince, I am erring on the side of 465 BC. That means that the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign began in 445 BC. This is the year that the decree was issued. This is where the clock starts ticking for the Messiah's arrival. And here is our updated timeline, where I substitute Nisan of 445 BC for the date that the command is issued, the start of the 173,880 days. And I substituted 396 BC for the rebuilding of Jerusalem, since that is 49 years or 7 weeks after the decree went out. Although I searched, I could not find any sources to corroborate that Jerusalem was finished in 396 BC. This does not mean that the prophecy is wrong, only that it is uncorroborated. But maybe I am wrong, maybe there is evidence that I am missing. What day in the month of Nisan should we use? According to Anderson, it was common Jewish practice to date things from the first of the month. This is because first Nisan was the Jewish New Year. It marked the beginning of their spring. One might object, saying that the Jews shouldn't have assumed that. After all, Artaxerxes could have given the decree any time in Nisan, and here the Jews go on assuming that it's the first of Nisan. But all that matters is what the prophecy meant to the Jews. Remember, this is being written to a Jewish audience, not us. So if Artaxerxes giving the decree in Nisan meant the first of Nisan to the audience to whom the prophecy was written, then the prophecy is saying the first of Nisan, even if that wasn't actually the case. But if we convert first Nisan in the Jewish calendar to the Julian calendar that we have today, that is March 14th. And I don't know how that is converted. I got it from The Coming Prince. But here is our updated timeline where March 14th, 445 BC is the start date for our prophecy. Okay, here comes the math. We will add 173,880 days to March 14th, 445 BC to see where that puts us. Note that this timeline is not to scale, but the timeline in AD doesn't start in the year 0 because there is no year 0. Our timeline starts in the year AD 1, which is the year directly after 1 BC. So, the first year AD covers the time period between AD 1 and AD 2. The second year AD covers the time between AD 2 and AD 3, and so on. Right now, we are in the 2026th year AD, so we say that the year is 2026. Now for BC, it's a little different. The first year BC is the time period between AD 1 and 1 BC. The second year BC is the time period between 1 BC and 2 BC. So for AD, the year is named after the year that started in that 12-month period. But for BC, the year is named after the year that ends in that 12-month period. So the 445th year BC would end in 444 BC on our timeline, meaning that we would put March 14th, 445 BC about a third of the way between 445 BC and 444 BC. Now we're going to add our 173,880 days in segments, starting from the segment that spans from March 14th, 445 BC to the end of the year 445, which is marked by the 444 BC on the timeline. That would be 365 days minus the number of days into the year that March 14th is. So that would be 365 minus 73, which is 292 days. Now let's add the number of days from the end of 445 BC to the beginning of our timeline in AD 1. That would be 365.25 days per year times 444 years, which is 162,171 days. I am using the 365.25 days per year as opposed to 360 because we are now using the Julian calendar and not the Jewish one. But if we add this to the 292 days spent in 445 BC, we get 162,463 days. So, 162,463 days of our 173,880 days in the prophecy are spent in BC. That means that 173,880 days minus 162,463 days are spent in AD. That is 11,417 days. And if we divide that by 365.25 days per year, that means 31.258 years are spent in AD. That is 31 years and 94 days. That would put us on the 32nd year AD. Particularly, the 94th day is April 4th, AD 32. So, Daniel 9 predicts that 173,880 days from the date of the decree, which is March 14th, 445 BC, the Messiah will come, meaning he is presented as prince before his people. So that raises the question, I wonder what event happens around April 4th, AD 32. Could it be the triumphal entry of Jesus, otherwise known as Palm Sunday, as the prophecy implies? Well, the purpose of Part 3 is to date the exact day of Palm Sunday to see how closely it falls to April 4th, AD 32. We will start that process by dating the year, which is not at all a simple process. We will date it in two ways. The first way dates Palm Sunday from the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry. According to Luke 3:1-3, his ministry began in the 15th year of the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. So John the Baptist started his ministry anywhere from 14 to 15 years from the time that Tiberius started to reign. And the beginning of his reign, according to secular sources, was in August. So John the Baptist started his ministry anywhere from August of AD 28 to AD 29. We also know that Jesus' ministry lasted about 3.5 years. We can think this because it included at least 3 and probably 4 Passovers, which were celebrated every year. These were recorded in John 2:13, John 6:4, and John 11:55-57, with the likely 4th Passover being between John 2 and John 6. I do not know why a 4th Passover is added. I only know that it is widely thought. But we know that Jesus was crucified right around the last Passover in John 11. We can add about 43 days to this, 3 days for being in the tomb, and 40 days that he spent with his disciples after his resurrection before he ascended. When he ascended into heaven, that marks the end of his earthly ministry. We can also add some time before the celebration of the first Passover, including about 40 days to be tempted after his baptism, as well as time for travel. Generally, scholars think that the time after the last Passover and the time before the first Passover amount to about 6 months, bringing the total time of his ministry to 3.5 years. So, if John started his ministry anywhere from 14 to 15 years after August of AD 14, and Jesus' ministry lasted 3.5 years, then we can bring the end of his ministry either to the spring of AD 32, if John the Baptist started earlier, or to the spring of AD 33, if John the Baptist started later. Also a factor is the amount of time after the start of John the Baptist's ministry that Jesus started his ministry. If one shortens this time frame, they are more likely to arrive at an AD 32 crucifixion year. So I think that based on what Luke records, we are left with 2 plausible options, 32 AD and 33 AD. Note that there are some who would hold to a 30 AD crucifixion year, but I don't see how they could reconcile that with what Luke says about the 15th year of Tiberius. If Jesus was crucified in AD 30, that would place the start of his ministry in the fall of AD 26, which would place John the Baptist's start date even earlier. But AD 26 is 2 to 3 years before the 15th year of Tiberius's reign, and would therefore contradict Luke. So, although I do not personally hold to an AD 30 crucifixion date for that reason, I thought I would mention it in case you wanted to investigate. So let's decide between AD 32 and AD 33. We know 2 things about Jesus' crucifixion. Firstly, it happened late in the week. Now, whether one holds to a Thursday view of the crucifixion, like myself, or to the traditional Friday view depends, but both agree that Jesus was crucified late in the week. Some also believe in a Wednesday view, but that is not common. We also know that Jesus was crucified within days of a Passover, since he celebrated the Passover the night before his crucifixion, and because of what the Gospels say about it being near the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which started the day after Passover. Now Passover was celebrated on the 14th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, which usually correlates to early April in our Julian calendars. Specifically, 14th Nisan fell on a Monday in AD 32, and it fell on a Saturday in AD 33. The latter date is more in keeping with the two facts about Jesus' crucifixion. If he were crucified in AD 32 on either Thursday or Friday, that would not be close to a Monday. Note that Anderson argues against this in pages 90 to 93 of his book, saying that in AD 32 that it is possible that the full moon from which the Passover was calculated could have been delayed by a day. Add another 3.75 days from the differences between the Jewish and the solar calendars, and one could very well have a Friday Passover in AD 32. He also says that the party that arrested Jesus needed no torch or lamp for light, suggesting a full moon. And yet, this was around Passover time and was later in the week, not earlier. So, there is much debate on the year of crucifixion. It is also possible that he was crucified in the spring of AD 34, since Passover fell on a Thursday, but I think that places his ministry start date a little too late, as we will see. So, spring of AD 33 is the most reasonable option and is held by most New Testament scholars. But let me present some evidence for AD 32 in the following slide. I do not personally hold to this view, but it is what Anderson posits in his book, The Coming Prince, so I would like to show why one might believe it. We can deduce that if Passover was in early April, then Jesus' ministry ended in mid-May, being about 43 days after the Passover. If we add that his ministry was about 3.5 years, we can deduce that it began in mid-November. So I am subtracting 6 months from May to get November. So let's make a timeline. We have the start of John the Baptist's ministry in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius. So that is anywhere from mid-August of AD 28 to mid-August of AD 29. And let's look at the first option for the end of Jesus' ministry, which would have been in mid-May of AD 32. So right here. If we subtract 3.5 years from this, we get that the start of his ministry would have been in roughly mid-November of AD 28, or a few months after the earliest possible start date for John the Baptist's ministry. The second option is that Jesus' ministry ended in mid-May of AD 33, which would bring the start date of his ministry to mid-November of AD 29, which is at least 3 months after the latest possible start date for John the Baptist's ministry. Note that the AD 33 view has Jesus starting his ministry anywhere from 3 to 15 months after John the Baptist started his, but it could be argued that the gospel accounts suggest that this time period was much shorter, leaving the only option as the AD 32 view. This would place the start of Jesus' ministry at most a few months after John the Baptist started his. Here is how that could be argued. The traditional date for Jesus' ministry is the day that he was baptized, and Mark 1:9 says that it was in those days, referring to the days in which John appeared in the wilderness to preach, that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee to be baptized, thus implying a short passage of time from the start of John the Baptist's ministry to the start of Jesus' ministry. Matthew 4:13 says, "Then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to John to be baptized by him," and "then" refers to the events after John the Baptist started his ministry. How long after is ambiguous, but it seems to imply that there wasn't a huge amount of time. And Luke 3:21 says, "Now when all the people were baptized, and when Jesus also had been baptized and was praying, the heavens were opened." Luke lumps all the people who were baptized, referring to those who were baptized from the start of John the Baptist's ministry and Jesus being baptized, into the same group, implying that maybe they were baptized together, or at least close together. In any case, if an entire year had passed like the traditional view says, it seems that the gospel writers would have made mention of some of the events in that year, but they didn't. Furthermore, John says in John 5:35 that John was a burning and shining lamp. Or Jesus says this, that John was a burning and shining lamp, and that the Jews were willing to rejoice for a while in his light. A while implies that it wasn't for long. Now the Gospels imply that John was arrested shortly after he baptized Jesus, probably during the 40-day period of Jesus' temptation, for they say that Jesus learned of John's arrest after he came back. Now if John was only tolerated for a while, then his start date could not have been long before Jesus' baptism. Of course, it is unclear how long a while is. But if we assume that the time frame of John's ministry was short, then that would cast doubt on an AD 33 view that has Jesus starting his ministry anywhere from 3 to 15 months after John the Baptist started his. It is more in keeping with the AD 32 view, which has Jesus starting at most 3 months after John the Baptist. It would definitely cast doubt on an AD 34 view, which would have Jesus starting 1 to 2 years after John the Baptist. In addition, Jesus was actually born around 4 BC, as we will see later, so the AD 33 view has him being around 32 years old when he started preaching, but the AD 32 date has him being closer to 31. But Luke 3:23 says that he was about 30 years of age when he started preaching. So the AD 32 date is more closely agrees with Luke. Lastly, the AD 32 date seems to be in more agreement with the date that the Jewish temple was completed. In John 2:20, the Jews tell Jesus that it took them 46 years to build the temple. Josephus noted in Antiquities that the start date for this was about 20 or 19 BC. If we add 46 years to that, that makes the completion of the temple around AD 27 or AD 28, with a possible but not likely extension into AD 29. And apparently, Jesus' ministry had already started by then. This is only consistent with an earlier view of his crucifixion. Of course, this assumes that the temple had been completed just around the time that the Jews told Jesus it took them 46 years to build this. If they had completed it at some earlier date and were merely telling Jesus about a past event, that would shift the date of John 2 forward into the realm of the AD 33 view. So, there are reasons to believe in an AD 32 date. I hold to the AD 33 date because it seems likely that John the Baptist would have needed time more than 3 months to attract the crowds that were present at Jesus' baptism, even though none of the gospel writers mention it. And most scholars hold to the AD 33 view, although I think that both are plausible. Now in history, it's never good to rest the entire weight of your argument on one source, which in this case is Luke's statement that John the Baptist began his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius. So let us confirm the general accuracy of our Palm Sunday date in another way. We will date it from Jesus' birth. Now, contrary to popular belief, Jesus was not born in the year 0, because there is no year 0, or even in the year AD 1, which is where our timeline starts. He was born roughly in the autumn of 4 BC, which we get from the following methods. We know that Jesus was born under the reign of King Herod of Israel, and while Quirinius of Syria was governor, according to Luke 2:2. We know from the account in Luke chapter 1 that Herod reigned at least 15 months before Jesus' birth. That is, verse 5 says that it was in the reign of Herod that Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, received word that John would be born. And verse 26 says that this occurred about 6 months before Mary conceived Jesus. So if we add 6 months from John's conception to Jesus' conception and 9 months for Mary's pregnancy, that gives us 15 months. And we also know that Herod reigned after Jesus' birth. Otherwise, he could not have given the order to kill the children in Bethlehem in an attempt to kill baby Jesus. So, if Herod reigned before Jesus' birth and after his birth, then he most likely reigned during his birth. And we know from Luke's account that Mary gave birth to Jesus in the time of the governor Quirinius' census. We also know from the historian with the last name of Clifford, from his account, that Herod died in the month of Adar of the year 3 BC. Adar correlates roughly to February or March on the Julian calendar, and Quirinius began his governorship in late 4 BC. So the time in which both Herod and Quirinius were in power was relatively short. It comprises a range roughly from October of 4 BC to March of 3 BC, about a 6-month time frame. Now we know that Jesus spent time in Egypt until Herod's death, which is recorded in Matthew 2:19 through 20. This shifts his birth date toward the beginning of this 6-month range. That is how we get the birth date of Jesus being around 4 BC, with Clinton estimating that Jesus was born 5 to 18 months before Herod's death. This was narrowed down since once Quirinius's governorship was added. And Luke 3:23 says that Jesus began his ministry when he was about 30 years of age, and we can add about 3.5 years to that for the length of his ministry. So if we add 33.5 years to the autumn of 4 BC, that puts us in the year AD 30, and we can add or subtract about 3 years from that, since Luke said that Jesus was about 30 years old. According to Anderson, the word that Luke uses for about allows for significant error, but only in the forward direction. So it is saying at least 30 years of age, with 30 being the age one had to reach in order to be accepted as a Jewish rabbi. So it does not contradict Luke to say that Jesus was a little older than 30 when he started his ministry. However, as mentioned earlier, the AD 32 does require less deviation from Luke's statement. In either case, the second method of dating corroborates our other date of AD 33 for the year of Palm Sunday. And one can add that Pontius Pilate, under whose governorship Jesus was crucified, reigned from AD 26 to 36, so that would corroborate the general time frame for Palm Sunday and the ensuing crucifixion. Now we know that the rough year of Palm Sunday, what was the month and day? Well, we know that Jesus had his triumphal entry shortly before a Passover celebration began. That was why there were so many Jews there to shout Hosanna. And we know that Passover, at least according to Exodus 12:6, was to be celebrated on the 14th of Nisan. This, in the Julian calendar, typically falls in early April, depending on when there is a new moon. I think they start the month of Nisan when there is a new moon, and the 14th would be 2 weeks after that. So here we can see the dates of Passover for about the next 15 years, which depends on the lunar cycle. Now, if we assume the year AD 32 for Jesus' triumphal entry, Anderson calculates that 14th Nisan, or Passover in AD 32, is April 14th on the Julian calendar. He also says that the Passover began on Thursday of the week of Palm Sunday. Sunday is 4 days before Thursday, bringing Palm Sunday to April 10th, AD 32. Now, if we deviate from Anderson and say AD 33, Passover on that year, according to my research, fell on Saturday, April 4th. If we add Anderson's statement that Passover was celebrated later in the week after Palm Sunday, as well as what the Gospel accounts say, that would bring Palm Sunday to 6 days before Passover, or March 29th, AD 33. For our purposes, let's use Anderson's date of April 10th, AD 32. In Part 4, I will summarize and conclude what we have covered and give its implications. Through a series of steps, we showed that Daniel 9:25 through 26 predicts that 173,880 days from the day of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, which we know is March 14th, 445 BC, that the Messiah will come. And based on the type of language it uses, this is reasonably equated with Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. 173,886 days from the decree, it happened. That is, the decree placed the triumphal entry on April 4th, AD 32. Using Anderson's date of April 10th, AD 32, that puts us to about 6 days within the time that the prophecy said it would happen. And this is from about 580 years in advance. That makes Daniel 9, if we use Anderson's date, at least 99.999% accurate. And of course, 4 to 5 days after that, depending on whether you hold to a Thursday or a Friday view of his crucifixion, Jesus was cut off, meaning killed, just as the prophecy says. Let me summarize the potential sources of error in order to show that the technical nature of this argument and the resulting possibility for error does not affect my conclusion. The first potential source was my statement at the beginning that Jesus is the Messiah, and that therefore Daniel 9 is talking about Jesus. I assumed this on the basis of previous arguments given from Psalm 22 and the suffering servant passage that Jesus fulfilled, showing that he is the Messiah beyond a reasonable doubt. I think that I had to assume this because Daniel 9 on its own only makes two predictions about the Messiah, the date of his arrival and the fact that he would be cut off, meaning killed, shortly afterwards. That is not enough for it to stand on its own. A skeptic could potentially attribute Daniel 9 to any public figure who showed up around the time of Jesus and died. So if you hear apologists or pastors saying that Daniel 9 on its own proves that the Bible is true, I think they might be overstating their case. This is debatable, but to err on the safe side, I assume, on the basis of stronger prophecies, that Jesus is the Messiah. This assumption is a safe one. If one disagrees, then I recommend that they go back and watch the videos on Psalm 22 and on the suffering servant passage. The next potential source of error is the dating of the authorship of Daniel. Remember how I said that some scholars think it was written in the 2nd century BC? I provided evidence against this, but I will pretend in the coming slides that this is a legitimate possibility to show that even that doesn't affect my conclusion. The next source of error is that I got the decree wrong. The runner-up behind the second decree of Artaxerxes is Cyrus's decree made in 537 BC. If this was the decree that Daniel was referring to, then the fulfillment would have been 483 years from 537 BC or 54 BC. And let's not forget to convert from the Jewish calendar, so that would subtract another 6 years, bringing the predicted fulfillment date to about 60 BC. In that case, Jesus' triumphal entry, assuming an AD 32 date, would have been about 91 years too late. Since the actual fulfillment occurred later than the predicted fulfillment, I assigned a negative value to the 91. That is, the prophecy is too early. So, getting the decree wrong has a potential error of negative 91 years. The next potential source is that I was wrong about the Jews using 360-day years. If they used 365-day years like we do, then the prophecy would have predicted that the Messiah would arrive in around AD 39, about 7 years after AD 32. Since the predicted fulfillment occurred 7 years after the actual fulfillment, I would say that the prophecy was too late and assign the error from this mistake to be positive 7 years. The next potential source, and I bolded this one because it is more likely, is Nehemiah's starting point. So when does he start counting the 20 years of Artaxerxes' reign? And there were two separate issues with this. The first is that he began counting from the first month of Nisan, and the second, more important issue, was that a reasonable case can be made for a decree date of 444 BC, since Artaxerxes didn't start reigning until 464 BC. In this case, the predicted fulfillment would be in AD 33, whereas the actual fulfillment was in AD 32. The prophecy would be 1 year too early, so this would be assigned an error value of negative 1 year. The next potential source, which is more or less likely, is that I got the event that fulfills the prophecy wrong. I said it was Palm Sunday. What if it was the beginning of Jesus' ministry? That would make the prophecy about 3.5 years too early. What if it actually meant the date that the Messiah was born? In that case, though I think this is very unlikely, the prophecy would be about 34 years too early, since Palm Sunday didn't occur until Jesus was about 34 years old. So, this would be assigned a maximum error value of negative 34 years. And this is the most likely source of error, in my opinion. It is the year of Palm Sunday. Anderson's book has Palm Sunday beginning or happening in AD 32, but I think a stronger case is made for AD 33, meaning that the prophecy predicted a date that was 1 year too early. So this source of error would be assigned a value of negative 1 year. That is about all the potential sources of error I can think of. In the following slide, I will show how my point is proven even if I grant the vast majority of these, with the exception of Jesus being the Messiah. In the left-hand column of this table, I have the source of error going from the least to greatest magnitudes. These magnitudes are listed in the next column over, so we have the two that I bolded, each contributing an amount of error of negative 1 year. I combined the error here because the maximum potential for error from both of these combined is 1 year. And I have the 360-day versus solar year error contributing an amount of positive 7 years, and getting the event wrong has a value of negative 34 years, with getting the decree wrong at negative 91 years. Now, it might be tempting if one is a skeptic to say, well, all I need to do is add up the sources of error. This can be done in some cases, but not all of them. For example, one could add the solar years mistake to getting the decree wrong. That is, if Daniel 9 was 1. Referencing Cyrus's decree in 537 BC, and 2. Predicted the Messiah to come in AD 39, then that would be a 575-year gap between the prophecy's start date and its fulfillment, not a 483-year gap like it says. So this would increase the amount of error to 98 years. That is the max potential for error if we combine any number of the mistakes, 98 years. Of course, that is not likely because I am fairly certain that Daniel 9 is not talking about Cyrus's decree, and it is even more unlikely that both mistakes are present. And for error values with the same sign in front of them, those actually cancel, not add. So that's the second column. In the third column, I give the percent accuracy of Daniel's prophecy, assuming an early date of authorship in the 6th century BC. For simplicity's sake, I assumed around 550 BC. So in this column, I divide the amount of error by the number of years before its fulfillment that Daniel was written. If we use the early date and assuming an AD 33 year of crucifixion, that is 582 years. In the fourth column, I assume a late date in the 2nd century BC. So for simplicity's sake, I say 150 BC. Assuming an AD 33 year of crucifixion, I would now be dividing the amount of error by 182 years. Again, this is not likely, but I am granting it to show that I do not need the early date to prove my point. Let me give an analogy to understand the fifth column. Imagine I walked up to you and said, in 182 years, Big Bird is going to fly through your great-grandson's window riding a pterodactyl. And 182 years later, it happened. Would you be concerned that I only predicted it 182 years in advance? No, because from my perspective, I had no idea when Big Bird would come. Likewise, Daniel did not know when Jesus would come, making his prediction all the more remarkable. And I am not comparing Big Bird to Jesus in more ways than my analogy dictates. Please don't overextend my analogy. I try to avoid sacrilege. But Big Bird is relevant here because up to this point I have treated, to the skeptic's benefit, the actual date of Daniel's fulfillment as if it were the last possible date of its fulfillment. But this is not the case. From Daniel's perspective, apart from his prophecy, he had little idea when Jesus was coming. Jesus could have come 100 years in the future or 10,000 years in the future. This is because the Old Testament, up until this point, is silent on the date of the Messiah's arrival. It gives details about the Messiah's upbringing, his birth, and his ministry and suffering, but none surrounding the time of his arrival. This is especially the case from the skeptic's perspective, since they would deny the reliability of these prophecies even if they did exist. As it is, Daniel knows that Jesus is coming, but he doesn't know when. From a secular perspective, he has to pick a date at any point in the future for Jesus' arrival. How far in the future could Jesus have arrived from Daniel's perspective? Let's err on the safe side and use today's date, 2026. And let's concede with the skeptic that Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC. So we would know that from Daniel's perspective, at some point between 150 BC and AD 2026, Jesus would come. The world has persisted for at least 2,175 years after Daniel's prediction. So that will be the fifth column. So how accurate is Daniel? Let's start in the third column, where I assume Daniel's traditional date of authorship and do not adjust for his perspective. The combined error of me getting Nehemiah's starting point wrong by 1 year and the year of Palm Sunday wrong is at most 1 year. This makes Daniel 9 99.8% accurate. What if I got the part about 360-day years wrong? What if the Jews used a solar year? That would introduce about 7 years of error, bringing the accuracy of Daniel 9 down to a paltry 98.8%. What if I got the event wrong? Introducing 34 years of error brings the accuracy down to a pathetic 94.1%. That is horrible. We should clearly reject Daniel 9 because there is a slim chance it was only 94% accurate, right? But what if I got the decree wrong? That would introduce about 91 years of error and bring the accuracy down to 81%. That's not quite as convincing, but it's still pretty good. Luckily for me, the chance of Daniel 9 referring to Cyrus's decree, which only mentioned rebuilding the temple but not the city, is low. Let's concede to the skeptic that Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC. If I got Nehemiah's starting point or the year of Palm Sunday wrong, Daniel 9 would be 99.5% accurate. If the 360-day year was wrong, it would be 96.5% accurate. If I got the event wrong, it is at the least 81.3% accurate. Still pretty good, right? If I got the decree wrong, it would be 49% accurate. I believe that this is the only possibility that the skeptic could take to escape the implications of Daniel 9. But they would have to provide much stronger evidence than that Daniel 9 is written at a later date, somehow show that the decree is referring to Cyrus's decree, and fudge the calculations so that it calculates the accuracy from our perspective instead of from Daniel's. So if you notice, the accuracy of Daniel 9 is still quite high, even if I concede the late date of authorship. But let's stop fudging the numbers to be nice. Let's calculate them as they should be, from Daniel's perspective of not knowing when Jesus would come. If I got Nehemiah's starting point or the year of Palm Sunday wrong, but not both, that would make Daniel 9 99.95% accurate. If I got the part about 360-day years wrong, Daniel would be a horrendous 99.7% accurate. If I got the event wrong, Daniel 9 is at worst 98.4% accurate. And if I got the decree wrong, it is still 95.8% accurate. This column is significant, for it calculates the actual accuracy of Daniel 9 even if I concede the late date of authorship. That is, even if Daniel was only written 150 years before Jesus' birth, it would still be at least 95% accurate. And I think the only reasonable source of error is the controversy surrounding the year of Palm Sunday, as well as the date of Artaxerxes' decree. So I bolded the 99.95% accuracy because it is the most reasonable estimate for Daniel's accuracy. Of course, these numbers reflect the maximum potential for error. There is a real possibility that the error is 0%, that Daniel got the exact day of Palm Sunday right. I think that given the 99.95% accuracy, that Daniel was probably inspired, in which case the remaining 0.05% error could be chalked up to human error on my part and not an inaccuracy in the prophecy itself. It is also possible that the prophecy never intended to be accurate down to the last day, but I don't think that is implied by the text. One might ask, well, what about the 6 days that Daniel 9 might be off by, or the 1 year? But let's think about how accurate Daniel 9 is. If you listened to any weather forecaster predict that you would get 10 inches of snow and you got 9.999 or 995 inches, or even 9.5 inches, you wouldn't reject that forecaster because they were off by a fraction of an inch. Or if they predicted 1,000 weather-related events and at least 950 of them came true, you wouldn't reject the forecaster because they were only 95% accurate. So, objecting to Daniel, saying that it was still off by 6 days, or by 1 year, or 91 years, or whatever, is ridiculous. And add to this that the fact that a weather forecaster has been trained to predict the weather, so their prediction is naturally explainable. But as stated, Daniel did not know when Jesus was coming, making his accuracy all the more difficult to explain naturally. And as stated, if Daniel 9 is inspired by a God who elsewhere claims to be all-powerful, then it would be reasonable to assume that Daniel did get the exact day correct, and that the only reason this video is not showing it is because of an error on my part. Now I assumed going into Daniel 9 on the basis of other videos that Jesus was the Messiah. I don't think that I needed to assume this, for Daniel 9 could probably stand on its own. That is, how many people besides Jesus were recognized by the Israelites as the Messiah and were afterwards cut off around AD 32? Not many. In fact, not any. So Daniel 9 is a testament all on its own to the messianic nature of Jesus. Nevertheless, I put it on the backs of even stronger prophecies like Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22 just to be safe. And for the Jew, it is even more difficult to avoid Daniel 9 than it is for the atheist. For they already believe in a Messiah and the Old Testament prophecies that predict his coming. For the Jew, they must believe on the basis of Daniel 9 that the Messiah is coming sometime around AD 32. And if it's not Jesus, who else would it be? Who else was recognized by the Jewish people as their Messiah and was afterwards cut off around this time? Sure, there were some social revolutionaries and false messiahs around that rough time that were maybe killed shortly afterwards, but the Jews don't accept these as their Messiah. As it is, the only way I can think of for the Jews to avoid Daniel 9 is to attack the idea that the 69 weeks actually refers to 483 years, or to possibly say that the prophecy is not messianic, neither of which are likely. Besides Daniel 9, there is a detailed account of secular history given in Daniel chapter 11, which prophesies about the kingdoms of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, which is so accurate that it has led many secular scholars to shift the date of Daniel's authorship to the 2nd century BC so as to place the fulfillment before the prophecy was made. As stated, this does not save them from Daniel 9:25 through 26, so we can trust what Daniel has to say about the future because of its track record of being right in the past. And Daniel, including in Daniel 9:24 and 27, which are the two verses that surround the prophecy about Palm Sunday, has much to say about the future. And the remainder of this video will focus on that for those who wish to know in more detail what exactly the implications of my argument are. For those who are content with saying that Daniel 9:25 through 26 is inspired, feel free to stop the video now and proceed to the next one in the series. Daniel 9:25 through 26 is surrounded by two verses that contain prophecies that have not yet been fulfilled. These are not prophecies that have been proven false, only ones that haven't been fulfilled yet. For example, Daniel 9:24 reads, 70 weeks are decreed upon the people and upon thy holy city to finish transgression and to make an end of sins and to make reconciliation for iniquity and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal up vision and prophecy and to anoint the most holy. Now the 70th week, I think, refers to the 7 years that the Antichrist rules, talked about in more detail in the book of Revelation. This hasn't happened yet. In between the 69th and 70th weeks is what is called the church age, the period that is 2,000 years and growing where the Christian church is on earth. And Daniel does not mention this, nor does the rest of the Old Testament. That will be addressed in more detail in the coming slide. For now, let's focus on what verse 24 says. It says that 6 things will occur at the end of the 70 weeks, the last 7 years before Christ comes back his second time. Now it is possible that these things refer to the millennial kingdom. I am not sure, but firstly, transgression will be finished. I think this means that evil will be ended once and for all, and this would include the people who love evil and choose to ally themselves with it. The verse also says that sins will be made an end of, which means a similar thing as finishing transgression, and it says that one will make reconciliation for iniquity. This, I think, means the final justice that is dispensed at Christ's second coming, where each person is judged according to their works. There, the people who did evil, who are not necessarily punished in this life, will get what they deserve if they do not repent. And Daniel says that everlasting righteousness will be brought in, which refers to the Messiah's everlasting kingdom that he sets up on earth. Right now, the kingdom of heaven lies in the hearts of believers, but it will be established physically when Christ comes back. And it says that it will seal up vision and prophecy. This, I think, refers to the fact that no more vision or prophecy will be needed. Think of it this way. those who would otherwise benefit from vision and prophecy have Christ directly in front of them, dwelling with them in the New Jerusalem. And those who would otherwise despise it will be eternally destroyed with no hope of remedy. So, vision and prophecy played their role in pointing people to Christ. Now that Christ has come, there is no more need for it. And Daniel says that the Most Holy will be anointed. This refers to Christ. In Revelation, it says that Christ will reign forever and ever on the throne from the New Jerusalem. If that sounds crazy, know that in the following 2 verses, Daniel predicts the date of Christ's triumphal entry with at least 99.95% accuracy. I think that is quite enough to establish his credibility in unfulfilled matters. After the prophecy that we studied is given, verse 27 says, "And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and even unto the end shall be war. Desolations are determined. And he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And upon the wing of abominations shall come one that maketh desolate, and even unto the full end, and that determined, shall wrath be poured out upon the desolate." Now the prince that shall come, I think, is the Antichrist who comes in the final times. And Daniel says that it is the Antichrist's people that will destroy the city, meaning Jerusalem, and the sanctuary, which I think means the temple. This again is referring to the end times. And Daniel says that unto the end shall be war, meaning that violence plagues the earth until Christ comes back. Unfortunately, it has to get worse before it can get better, a point that is affirmed in the book of Revelation or in Jesus' prediction of the end times in Matthew 24. And Daniel says that the Antichrist shall make a firm covenant for 1 week, meaning 7 years. And it says that in the midst of that week he will abolish the sacrifice. This, I think, refers to the 1260-day period in Revelation known as the tribulation. 1260 days is 3.5 years in the Jewish calendar, which is why Daniel says in the midst of the week it will happen. Even if one doesn't believe this, the internal consistency of the Bible is remarkable. Daniel is the Old Testament equivalent of Revelation, and they overlap with each other in an intricate manner. But Daniel says that the Antichrist shall maketh desolate. This, I think, refers to the abomination that causes desolation talked about in Revelation and in Matthew 24. Basically, it is a complete dishonoring of the Jewish religion. And Daniel says that wrath will be poured out on the desolate. And I think this refers to Israel, meaning that much will afflict the nation of Israel in the end times before Christ comes to save the day and bring in the things mentioned in verse 24, like everlasting righteousness and the finishing of transgression. Again, the church age is mysteriously missing from this prophecy, as it is in the rest of the Old Testament. Before we answer this, a key point here is that what God doesn't say does not make him unreliable in the things that he does say. That is, even if it was misleading for God to not mention the church age, that does not make Daniel's ability to predict the time of Palm Sunday any less remarkable. Ultimately, posing the church age as an objection to Daniel 9 is a red herring, meaning that it is an irrelevant distraction. But some might say that I am applying a different hermeneutic, or a double standard, inserting this 2,000-year period to Daniel 9 to make it agree with Christianity. But the absence of the church age is a common theme throughout the Old Testament. So, when we see a prophecy like Daniel 9 that speaks of the Messiah, we should expect that everything leading up to his coming follows a timeline like ours, but that everything after it doesn't necessarily do so. So, the first 69 weeks are not made unreliable by this gap, the insertion of which is fully consistent with the rest of the Old Testament. Of course, saying that it is consistent with the rest of the Old Testament doesn't satisfy the one who does not believe Scripture. They would simply say, well, bringing in other examples of God's dishonesty does not justify it. All you have done is show that the entire Old Testament is misleading. Because from Daniel's perspective, and from the perspective of all the other Old Testament prophets, they had to think that what we know is Jesus' second coming would be shortly after his first coming. And I think it is good to have the right heart when we ask questions like this. We must acknowledge that God, our Creator, is not obligated to tell his creation what all his plans are. I think it is okay for him to not tell people in the Old Testament about the church age. He isn't accountable to us. He doesn't have to debrief his plans to us humans so that he might gain our approval. He is God and can withhold whatever information he wants, and that doesn't make the information he does choose to disclose any less reliable. As it is, the absence of the church age should warn those who would presume to know in exact detail what God's plans are. But for those who are curious, I think there is at least one reason as to why God doesn't mention the church age in the Old Testament, for which an analogy will be given. Let's say that there is a murder and an ensuing manhunt, and that eventually the suspect is caught. After a lengthy trial, he is finally convicted and sentenced to death. After being on death row for 20 years, he is executed. Let's say that the whole process from murder to execution took 25 years. We would say that chronologically speaking, the most important part of this process is the time spent on death row, 20 out of 25 years, or 80% of the time. But we do not view such a series of events chronologically. We say that once the person is put on death row, that they are as good as dead. Justice is served. Perhaps for this reason, the news stations cover the story in less detail once the convict is sentenced, and most people tune out until 20 years later when the convict is executed. One can say that we view such a series of events with the end in mind. We view the events causally, not chronologically. And I think that might be how the first and second comings of Christ are viewed in the Old Testament, because everything that Jesus will execute in the 70th week, he accomplished in the 69th week. When Jesus was cut off, he essentially put death on death row. That's right, death is on death row, waiting to be destroyed. Having paid the price for his people, Jesus robbed death of its sting and stripped it of its power. Having spelled its doom, God has sworn in his sovereignty that it is only a matter of time before death is executed once and for all. Death is as good as dead. Jesus might as well have come back 7 years after his death for how certain it was. So, just as we view the convict on death row with the end in mind, I think, without presuming to know God's thoughts, that maybe he viewed Christ's first and second comings the same way, through a causal, not necessarily a chronological lens. That is, spiritually speaking, there is not much to separate the 69th week and the 70th week of Daniel's prophecy. So I am not applying a double standard here. The entirety of Scripture must be viewed spiritually, and most of the time, that lines up with how we expect the timeline to work. However, Christ's second coming, from the perspective of the Old Testament, is not one of those times. As it is, elsewhere in Scripture, God treats Christ's first coming as though it had already happened, overlooking the sins of people in the Old Testament, applying Christ's atonement to them. The fact that God treats Christ's second coming in the same way should comfort those who put their hope in him. The end, in God's view, is already done. In the eyes of him who sees the end from the beginning, it is finished, it has been finished, and it will be finished. His sovereign will, enabled by Christ's work, guarantees it. And we have passages like Daniel 9:24 through 25 to evidence the certainty of this promise. That is everything. In the next video, I will present even more evidence, unpacking other prophecies outside of Psalm 22, the suffering servant passage, and Daniel 9 that Christ fulfilled. And at the end of that video, I will summarize everything we have covered in Old Testament prophecy, showing how startlingly accurate the Bible is hundreds of years in advance. I hope to see you there. Thank you for watching.